Hello, everyone. Before we begin, I do want to start with a brief land acknowledgement and say that with gratitude, we acknowledge that the land First Safer Space meets on is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wombat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and that we are all treaty people. We are grateful to be working and living on this land, and by extension, will respect and take care of it. So, welcome again to the book club presentation. My name is Kristen, and I am a placement student here at For a Safer Space. I am currently in my last year of my Bachelor of Social Work program, and I'm studying at Ryerson University. And I'm very excited to be able to talk about this literature with you. So the book that we will be discussing is Your Silence Will Not Protect You. It was written by Audre Lorde and published in 2017. Overall, some of the larger main themes are sexism, racism, homophobia, as well as survival, silence, and change or resiliency. Now, we won't be talking about the whole book in one sitting. I have divided it into 5 parts. So for part 1, we're going to be discussing the main theme of silence. And because this book is actually a collection of essays and poems that were written by Lorde and not an actual storyline, I have chosen a handful of essays and a handful of poems to incorporate to this presentation. So the first one is called The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. The other essays are Poetry is Not a Luxury and Scratching the Surface, some notes on barriers to women and loving. And the poems that I've included are entitled Equinox, For Each of You, Love Poem, Good Mirrors Are Not Cheap, Black Mother Woman, and Dear Tony. So I won't be delving into each of these works of writing specifically, but the theme of silence does contribute in one way or another to each of these writings. So that's what we're going to focus on for right now. But for context, I feel it is important to talk a little bit about who Audre Lorde was. So Audre Lorde lived from 1934 to 1992, and she was born in Harlem, New York. She openly identified throughout her adult life as a Black lesbian social mother warrior poet, but is also a self-named feminist and social activist. She has become most famous for being able to discuss complicated issues of injustice in a way that a large audience can understand, and that was through her essays and poetry, some of which, or a lot of which, are in this book. And so even though the book was published in 2017, the collection of poems and essays were published between 1977 and 1989. It does seem that that was a long time ago, but the themes that are in this book are still present today in society. I do want to provide a brief content warning. For this presentation, I will be talking about hate, violence against women, as well as community violence. So I invite you to take care of yourself and to be kind to yourself and do what you need to do if something comes up for you. But I also want to acknowledge that the language used in this presentation, especially with some of the quotes that I've included, might be a little difficult to understand. So whenever you see this asterisk sign right here, that means that I have included a definition of the word at the bottom right hand of the slide. Okay, so without further ado, let's talk about silence. So Lorde speaks specifically to silence of racism, sexism, homophobia, and classism. So the idea behind the silence is that that's actually how these issues continue in society. Basically, if we aren't talking about it, we are allowing it to happen. And that is the stance that Lorde is taking. And that we are actually silent. We are actually silent because of fear. for the most part. We fear because we are silent, and by that I mean we are often fearful to have conversations that no one else is having. It can be very scary to be the first one to start these difficult and often complex conversations. And by extension, we are silent because we are fearful. So because of the fear, we remain silent about these issues, which again, in turn, allows them to continue. And often silence is learned, as Lorde suggests, that how we exist in society actually can teach us to be silent about these issues. But it could also be based on how you were raised, the culture you're from, even your family traditions that might make it difficult to have certain conversations. There's a lot of complexity as to why we are silent or why we have been taught to be silent about issues of racism, sexism, classism, and homophobia. And Lorde also goes into the many examples of how we are silent. And honestly, a lot of these examples we may not even be aware of right away. So for example, we are often silent to protect our own comfort. When talking about issues of racism and sexism, homophobia, and classism, those are very uncomfortable conversations at times. So it's natural to be uncomfortable and then to want to protect your own comfort. And a lot of the time that looks like remaining silent about it. Silence is also used to avoid conflict, especially if we want to engage in a conversation that we're not sure how it's going to play out. There's more fear there. And so then to avoid the potential conflict, we remain silent. Also, family tradition, as I mentioned, whether it be a biological family tradition or a chosen family tradition, it could be very hard to raise questions or to challenge people closest to us about these complex issues. And also, Lorde also talks about how some people may be silent because they feel like they don't know enough. For the people who don't experience racism, sexism, homophobia, and classism, it might be challenging to speak of those issues because of the lack of personal experience. But as Lorde mentions, and as I'll get into in a minute, that is problematic as well, because it's another example of silence, which again doesn't challenge these issues, which means they can remain within society. So when Lorde talks about silence, she does it in a way that gets us to acknowledge how we are silent, and then we could start to work and reflect within ourselves on how to break the silence. So what Lorde is really trying to do is encourage us to be honest with ourselves and our experiences and to talk about them. So to be able to share how we are feeling and to challenge some of these issues in society like racism, sexism, classism is the only way we can begin to break them down. So let's break silence. So Lorde does this herself through poetry, and I do want to touch on her poetry in a minute because poetry seems to be a unique form that can be very expressive of different experiences. But as Lorde mentions, it is not without its challenges. Breaking silence is a scary thing to do. There's fear about not being believed. That is a big one, especially if it was a traumatic experience for you and you want to begin to discuss it, but you're again fearful of how it's received. That is a challenging thing to overcome. There's also the challenge of living in autopilot. And what I mean by this, I mean the people who go from day-to-day life just taking in the world as it is without really stopping to reflect or challenge anything that's happened within their daily life. So they're just kind of going along and not reflecting and not challenging anything. And that is a dangerous form of silence in itself because, again, it goes completely unacknowledged and almost invisible. And finally, again, as Lorde had mentioned a few times within her essays, that being able to break silence is challenging just to put the words together at times. If our experiences are very complex in a way that other people may not share the same experience, it can be challenging to talk about it to begin with. So this is what Lorde has to say about us as an audience breaking the silence. So it says, "This is not an idle fantasy, but a disciplined attention to the true meaning of 'it feels right to me.' We can train ourselves to respect our feelings and transpose them into a language so that they can be shared." And that is from her essay, "Poetry is Not a Luxury." So here you can see she's encouraging us to find a way, whether it's from poetry or another way, to convert what we're feeling on the inside into words and how it can be explained to others. So with that, I do want to talk about her poetry for a second. Lorde uses poetry as a great outlet to talk about many issues that can have many layers. And that's the thing that I personally like about Lorde's poetry, in that there's so many interpretations that it can take. So here I have a small quote from one of her poems, and I just want to read it quickly. It says, "Speak proudly to your children, wherever you may find them. Tell them, you are the offspring of slaves, and your mother was a princess in darkness." And that is from her poem, "For Each of You." And I like this poem because from when I read it the first time to even when I just read it now, I always find a different way to look at it. First of all, I really like how it opens with this: "Speak proudly to your children," because that is right in line with breaking silence. To speak proudly to your children is to teach your children. And I also like the interpretation of resiliency in this, that, oh yes, we are the offspring of enslaved people. You know, we are still powerful, and our mothers are our power and respect. And oops, there we go. And so I don't want to go too far into the interpretations of this poem, but there are many intersecting themes here. So while yes, there is obviously some racial tones here too, but talking about the mother as a princess is such truth. And I really like how Lorde, within this particular stanza, was able to express herself. And while yes, poetry is not for everybody, this is just an example of how many layers can be involved within poetry. So while we're talking about silence, there are many impacts that the silence have within our communities. Lorde specifically critiques how Black communities and feminist communities address issues of racism, sexism, and homophobia. And the result of this silence, in most cases, is inter-community conflict and inter-community violence. Now, Lorde speaks to specifically the Black community and does this with explaining the death of Patricia Cohen. So again, for context, Patricia Cohen was a young Black actress who was murdered by a Black man during an audition. And this particular incident in 1977 was emphasized by Lorde because despite coming from the same community, in that both Patricia Cohen and her murderer were Black, there is still issues of sexism involved in there, and classism involved, and violence and hate involved. So even though seemingly these two people were from the same community and facing the same threat of, say, racism, there's still that inter-community conflict. So this is what Lorde had to say about Patricia Cohen's death. It reads, "Patricia Cohen was not killed because she was Black. She was killed because she was a Black woman." And that's from Scratching the Surface. So you can see there's more depth to this incident than just violence. There's entangled other themes there as well. So this is another way to put it, or as Lorde puts it within her essays. There's silence from Black men regarding sexism against Black women. There is silence from white women regarding racism against Black women. And there's also silence from heterosexual men and women regarding homophobia. And again, with every instance of silence, it just allows it to continue. So therefore, homophobia, sexism, racism, classism exist across all communities because we remain silent about them within our communities. And this can greatly influence how we come together to make change or how to fight back against things like racism, sexism, classism, etc. So this is what Lorde has to say about intercommunity violence. I really like this quote because I think she frames it very well, and we are able to visualize what she's saying. So regarding intercommunity violence, this reads, "This kind of action is a prevalent error among oppressed peoples. It is based upon the false notion that there is only a limited and particular amount of freedom that must be divided between us, and the largest and juiciest pieces of liberty going as spoils to the victor or the stronger. So instead of joining together to fight for more, we quarrel between ourselves for a larger piece of the one pie." And that quote is also from Scratching the Surface. So I just want to read this bottom part again. "So instead of joining together to fight for more, we quarrel between ourselves for the larger piece of the one pie." And I think that is a really great way to look at it, to understand it, that instead of joining together to fight for our liberty as a whole, we are instead too busy fighting each other for that same liberty. So Lorde does offer some solutions, thankfully, in that we can break these issues down within our community by first of all speaking to it. We need to speak about it, to think about it, to fix it, right? And the other part of this is understanding our differences. For example, using myself as a white woman, my experiences in this world would be very, very different from a Black woman who may be my same age, attending the same school, in the same program. And so it's those differences that we need to talk about. We need to discuss and maybe not even solve right away, but at least to have a level of understanding is a great first step to talk about some of these issues. And overall, Lorde's concluding thought was essentially that we can learn a lot from each other and that we don't have to be silent about these issues anymore because people experience them almost daily, just in different ways. So once we can have a better understanding of the ways that racism, sexism, homophobia, and classism work, then we can begin to work together and really break them down. So before we end off, this is probably one of my favorite quotes that I've read so far of Audre Lorde, and it's her perspective on breaking silence. So I'll read it briefly. "It is never without fear of visibility, of the harsh light of scrutiny, and perhaps judgment, of pain, of death. But we have lived through all of these already, in silence, except death. And I remind myself all the time now that if I were to be born mute or have maintained an oath of silence my whole life long for safety, I would still have suffered and I would still die. It is very good for establishing perspective." And essentially what Lorde is saying is that we are already suffering, and why should we have to suffer in silence? If we are going to, as Lorde mentions from this quote, if we're already going to suffer and die, we may as well use our voices in the meantime. So with that, I want to thank you for watching, and I will see you next time for part 2.